Welcome back to the War Room, where we're going to take a look at a naval battle. Mostly because we haven't devoted a whole episode to one yet, but also because naval warfare has a very different flavour to warfare on land. And the Battle of Stromvaer, also known as the Action of Lofoten, is a good example. This was part of the German invasion of Norway, taking place on the morning of the 9th of April 1940. With the outbreak of war in 1939, the primary naval focus of the war in Europe became the North Sea, and the competing geographies of the belligerents meant that the German Kriegsmarine was at an automatic disadvantage. The Kriegsmarine could only enter the North Sea via a thin strip of coast west of Denmark, or by transiting the Skagerrak between Denmark and Norway. And they could only leave the North Sea by attempting to pass through the narrow English Channel to the southwest, or by steaming north through the Shetlands Bergen Gap. The British Royal Navy, meanwhile, was based on an island that literally separated the North Sea from the Atlantic and had easy access to both. Aided by the French Marine Nationale, the Royal Navy was in a prime position to pen the Kriegsmarine in the North Sea, preventing it from getting out into the Atlantic and attacking the Allies' vital sea lines of communication. Geography goes on to further disadvantage the Kriegsmarine. The main threat to Germany would always be land-based, and as such the German army would always be the priority for defence. No amount of battleships would ever stop opposing armies marching into Germany across its extensive frontiers. Great Britain was in the opposite position. As an island, any invasion could only come by sea, as well as the food and raw materials that Britain needed to survive. So Britain relied on the Royal Navy for its defence and prioritised that when it came to the budget. The result was a natural imbalance of forces. In 1939, the Royal Navy was the largest navy in the world. In its home waters in the Atlantic, it could call on 168 major surface vessels, plus another 26 from the French. The Kriegsmarine could field 73, but 41 of those were U-boats. In terms of surface fleets, the Allies had 169 vessels to the Germans' 32. And this doesn't count the hundreds of other British and French naval vessels on station elsewhere in the world that could be recalled if necessary. So the Allies had a significant quantitative advantage. Qualitatively, the picture is less clear. Warships are very expensive to build and very expensive to maintain, but at the same time, they not only don't last forever, but can be rendered obsolescent or even obsolete by technological developments. Squeezed by financial constraints in the interwar period, much of the Royal Navy's strength was still of First World War vintage, while the German Navy, having started from scratch after the loss of its entire strength in 1918, had been built much more recently and, as a result, was much more modern. Whether the teething problems and inexperience that go along with fresh designs outweigh the tiredness of old vessels from previous generations is a difficult question, but there were certainly ships in the Kriegsmarine that could outperform their counterparts in the Royal Navy, at least in some respects. Given this naval imbalance, the Royal Navy settled in for a rerun of World War I, when they had successfully neutralised their German opponents by confining them to the North Sea. Although the Germans had refused to acquiesce to Gotterdammerung in some kind of Nelsonian masterpiece, they had also been unable to cut Allied sea lines of communication or break the blockade that starved Imperial Germany into submission. Inevitably, the Germany of the Second World War sought to avoid that fate and, with the eventual fall of France entirely unanticipated, looked north to Denmark and Norway. Occupying both would remove the neutral eastern flank of the North Sea, creating a coastal corridor that would allow naval access to the Norwegian Sea. From there, supported by bases in Norway, it would be much easier for German surface raiders and U-boats to break out into the Atlantic and attack British merchant shipping. It would also secure vital iron imports from Sweden, which were shipped from the port of Narvik in northern Norway, and help offset the strangulating effects of the British blockade. Naturally, the Allies were also aware of this possibility, and both sides simultaneously courted the neutral Norwegians and developed plans to secure the country against their enemies. These efforts reached a head after the Altmark incident in February 1940. The German tanker Altmark, carrying British prisoners captured by the pocket battleship Graf Spee, was attempting to return to Germany down the Norwegian coast. Chased by Royal Navy destroyers into Jossingfjord, Norwegian waters, the Altmark was ultimately boarded by HMS Cossack and the prisoners liberated, despite unarmed opposition from Norwegian Navy vessels that were present. The incident provided impetus for planning on both sides. The Germans had their fears of British willingness to intervene in Norway confirmed, while the British had evidence that the Germans would abuse Norwegian neutrality. As such, the Royal Navy went ahead with one of its plans, Operation Wilfred, on the 8th of April. This was a plan to lay a series of actual and dummy minefields in Norwegian coastal waters, in order to force vessels out into international waters where Allied naval vessels could intercept them without further violations of Norwegian neutrality. At 05:15 on the 8th, the Allies publicly announced the details of their mine-laying, prompting protests from the Norwegian government. At the same time, though, the Germans had already embarked on their Operation Weserübung, with the intent of occupying both Denmark and Norway before the British and French could. The Norwegian component of the plan, pitched as an intervention to protect Norwegian neutrality by invading it, is perhaps best described as a refuge in audacity. The plan called for amphibious landings at Egersund, Oslo, Kristiansand, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. Committing to 6 different landings is bad enough, but they're spread across 1,700 kilometers of coastline under the nose of a superior force. The German plan relied on speed, surprise, and deception. Not only would the Norwegians find themselves occupied before they even realised they were at war, but the Royal Navy would be caught on the back foot. Without the restrictions that terrain brings to land-based movement, naval forces have incredible freedom of manoeuvre and are able to remain hidden in the featureless immensity of the open sea. This combination of forces that could be anywhere, travelling in any direction, creates immense uncertainty. The troops for the landings were carried in naval vessels with the speed to reach their objectives before the Allies could work out what was going on, and German merchant vessels with stocks of supplies, fuel, and ammunition had exploited Norwegian neutrality to pre-position themselves in the ports to be attacked. While the landings were taking place, the 2 new battleships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, would be steaming north as if they were attempting a breakout into the Atlantic, a course of action the British would consider much more likely than a full-fledged amphibious attack on Norway. This diversionary element is what leads to the Battle of Stromvaer. At about 8 PM on the 8th of April, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and the 10 destroyers they were escorting reached the entrance to the Vestfjord. Detaching from the destroyers, which carried on up the Vestfjord to Narvik, the 2 battleships turned northwest into the Norwegian Sea to carry out the diversion. Under the command of Vice Admiral Gunther Lutyens, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were the Kriegsmarine's 2 functional battleships at the start of the war. The larger and more heavily armed Bismarck was afloat, but wouldn't be commissioned until August. Laid down in 1935, both ships were modern German designs. They had a top speed of 32 knots, displaced 32,600 tons, were manned by a crew of 1,669 men, and carried a main battery of 9 11-inch guns in 3 turrets. This wasn't the originally intended armament. They were supposed to have dual 15-inch guns, but the 11-inch triples were available at the time of construction, and plans to upgrade were scuppered by the war. Despite this, 9 11-inch guns certainly still represented a significant threat to Allied shipping and naval vessels, especially when backed up by the secondary armament of 12 6-inch and 14 4.12-inch guns. Part of what made their diversionary role so effective was the 2 battleships' capacity to cruise the Atlantic at speed, preying on lightly defended convoys and disappearing into the vastness of the ocean before stronger forces could catch them. The ships encountered problems in heavy seas though, and as they steamed northwest, they ran into a significant storm. This was travelling west-northwest and increased the hurricane's strength around midnight. Haar, in his book The German Invasion of Norway, relates that mountainous seas were breaking over Scharnhorst, distorting bulkheads and developing cracks. Evidence of metal fatigue was even reported from the bows and the upper works. Just after midnight, one malicious wave broke a vent shaft, which let seawater flow through the intake, polluting 7 oil tanks and making some 470 cubic meters of fuel oil unusable. The port engine had to be temporarily shut down. Lutyens was forced to reduce speed to 9 knots, while his 2 battleships were battered by the waves and buffeted by driving hail and snow squalls. By 0200, the wind strength was starting to drop off. Now about 50 kilometers southwest of Lofoten, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were able to make 12 knots, and they were on the edge of the storm system. It still raged off to their west, but to the east the horizon was clear. Unbeknownst to the Germans, though, they were not the only ships in the area. The Royal Navy's mine-laying effort for Operation Wilfred consisted of a mix of light ships, destroyers and mine-layers. Covering these, mostly in order to intimidate and deter the Norwegians, was HMS Renown, under the command of Vice Admiral William Whitworth. HMS Renown was a much older vessel than Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. It had been commissioned back in 1916 as a battlecruiser, and undergone 2 reconstruction efforts in the interwar period to keep her up to standard. In 1940, she could just about make 31 knots, was operated by a crew of 1,200, and displaced 36,660 tons. This was about 6,000 tons more than when she was built, meaning that she sat lower in the water than intended, and although she didn't suffer the same kind of structural problems as the Scharnhorst class in heavy seas, she still had her share of problems. As for armament, Renown was armed with a main battery of 6 15-inch guns in 3 dual turrets, and a secondary battery of 20 4.5-inch guns, also in dual turrets. On the evening of the 8th of April, Whitworth in Renown, accompanied by 9 destroyers, had actually been stationed at the mouth of the Vestfjord. But on hearing reports from earlier in the day that a Sunderland flying boat had spotted German warships north of Kristiansand, heading west, he made the decision to try and intercept them before they could make a break for the Atlantic. Steaming west, with the intention of turning south at midnight, Whitworth unknowingly left Westfjorden open to the German element heading for Narvik. The ships spotted by the Sunderland were actually the cruiser Hipper and her accompanying destroyers destined to seize Trondheim. In position for their part of the operation early, they simply happened to be heading west when encountered by the Sunderland while they waited for their time to attack. The British Admiralty, facing increasing signals that something was going on, ordered Whitworth to turn around and block Westfjorden, but by the time he received the message it was too late. Renown and the destroyers had steamed into the storm, and it was all but impossible for the smaller ships to do anything but ride it out, lest they were lost. Whitworth could have returned to Westfjorden in HMS Renown, which was able to power its way through the heavy seas in a way that the destroyers couldn't, but he elected to stay with them. As a result, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau missed an encounter with Renown on the evening of the 8th at the Westfjord, but actually ended up following Whitworth. With the storm weakening after midnight, Whitworth was able to gather his destroyers up and start making his way back to the Westfjord. By 0240, he was steering 130 degrees at 12 knots, unknowingly set to intercept the German squadron. Renown is the first to make a spot at 0337, sighting 2 vessels passing on an opposite course about 16 kilometers to the east. The crew identified the 2 vessels as a Scharnhorst-class battlecruiser and a Hipper-class cruiser. We know that that's incorrect, but misidentification is very common with visual naval engagements as a rule, never mind those at night in bad weather. Adding to the problem, German capital ship designs at the time were all visually quite similar. Bismarck-class battleships, Scharnhorst-class battlecruisers, and Hipper-class heavy cruisers all shared the same general profile and were most easily distinguished by their relative sizes, something that can be very difficult to judge at sea. Whitworth makes the decision to engage. HMS Renown makes a turn to 080 degrees, then to 305 10 minutes later, coming onto a parallel course and starting to build up speed. She's now in a classic attack position. Behind her is the darkened sky of the western horizon and the storm. Behind the 2 German ships is the open eastern horizon, which will soon start to grow light with the oncoming dawn. It will be much easier for Renown to see her targets and the fall of her shot than it will be for the Germans to see Renown and their shell impacts. Whitworth has found himself with the option to engage the enemy at a tactical advantage and immediately taken it. Although the Germans have yet to show any signs of reacting, Gneisenau actually picked Renown up on its radar, and this was reported to the bridge at 0350. Gneisenau's captain didn't immediately inform Lutyens, though. The radar had been catching false returns all day due to the weather, so he sought a visual confirmation. They didn't get this until 0359, the men in the foretop rangefinders first reporting a tanker, then a Nelson-class battleship. The ship sounded the alarm at 0400, relaying the contact to Scharnhorst, which had picked up nothing until then. Soon after, at 0405, HMS Renown opened fire from a distance of about 15 kilometers. The two German ships were not quite caught unawares, but were unable to react quickly, not beginning to return fire until 0410. The Battle of Stromvaer was on. Both sides have asymmetric aims here. Whitworth has encountered a significant German force, at least one battleship, and he needs to stop it breaking out. Sure, he's supposed to be guarding Westfjorden, but he knows that this is a higher strategic priority. And Whitworth doesn't need to sink his opposition. The Royal Navy has overwhelming strength of numbers in its surface fleet. It can call on land and carrier-based aircraft. Once any German naval force has been discovered, its survival becomes an exercise in how fast the Royal Navy can concentrate assets to destroy it, versus the speed at which it can flee to safety, whether that's by returning to friendly waters or disappearing into the vastness of the ocean. If a German vessel suffers damage that slows it down, it's got a good chance of being dead meat. Ships take a long time to build and work up. Replacing lost vessels is very difficult, especially for the navy of a country like Germany. Any losses the Royal Navy can inflict on the Kriegsmarine are essentially permanent. So even though trying to take on Scharnhorst and Gneisenau with an old battlecruiser like Renown could be a significant challenge, there's real strategic value on the table if Renown can get some good hits in. And the Germans fully understand this. They know how risky it is to try and go toe-to-toe with the Royal Navy. Lutyens has orders to avoid battle with superior opponents. He's steaming into the Norwegian Sea as a distraction. Even later in the war, when the Kriegsmarine sends capital ships out into the Atlantic, they're going out there to prey on merchant shipping, not to try and take on the Royal Navy. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are certainly performing their role in Operation Weserübung by getting into an engagement with Renown. They're going to contribute to British fears of a breakout attempt and give the landing forces the time and space they need to seize Norway, but they also need to make sure they don't become decisively engaged. And Lutyens doesn't know what he's up against. Although Renown is soon identified, the British destroyers following it are fanning out and opening fire as well. With extra muzzle flashes in the dark and the misidentification of a Nelson-class battleship lingering in the collective consciousness of Gneisenau's bridge, the Germans are worried that there's more than one Royal Navy capital ship engaging them. So Lutyens orders his squadron to turn away to 350 degrees and put on speed. This sacrifices firepower. Only the aft turrets can be brought to bear, and as they crawl up to 27 knots, the two battleships are being battered so much by the seas that spotting and accuracy are seriously degraded. This is too much for the captain of Gneisenau, who suggests a minor course change that would lessen the damage and reopen the firing angles of the forward turrets. Lutyens agrees, and the two battleships come to 330 degrees. The Germans attempting to escape is a problem for Renown. She's not as fast as the two more modern battleships to begin with, and with all the extra weight from her refits, she's sitting low in the water and getting even more abuse from the heavy seas. The fastest she can go is about 24 knots. The destroyers are in an even worse state. They don't have the mass to maintain stability in the heavy seas, and they're not only unable to actually hit anything with their guns, but unable to get up enough speed to close the range for torpedo attacks. They're also starting to come under fire from Scharnhorst and Gneisenau's secondary batteries, so Whitworth orders them to hold off and plunges on with just Renown. All the while, the capital ships are trading salvos. At 04:15, Renown is hit by two 11-inch shells. The first hits the foremast. There are no casualties, but wireless aerials are cut and cabling for the radio direction finding equipment is severed. The second shell hits aft and penetrates into some storage spaces. This causes minor flooding, but again, no casualties. Both of these hits were probably from Gneisenau, which was firing high explosive rather than armor-piercing shells. It's not clear exactly why she was doing that, but it does explain the limited effects. Gneisenau had just spotted these impacts when, at about 04:17, she was hit by one of Renown's 15-inch shells.
This came screaming in with the British ship's 16th salvo,
which shows how difficult it was to get shots on target, and it strikes the foretop. This is where Gneisenau's gunnery was directed from. The hit wrecks the main rangefinder and the radar, killing 6 men, including the gunnery officer, and wounding 9 more. With the foretop out of action, Gneisenau was forced to cease firing until secondary fire direction positions could take over. Not long after, Renown scored another 2 hits, this time from its secondary battery of 4.5-inch guns. One of these hits a flak platform on the port side, doing negligible damage, but the other hits turret Anton, damaging the turret's integral rangefinder and opening it up to the sea. With water pouring in from the heavy seas and short-circuiting the traverse mechanisms, the turret was out of action until the next day. Scharnhorst, having seen Gneisenau take some hits and stop firing, alters course and makes smoke, drawing between her sister ship and Renown to conceal her and draw fire. Renown obligingly switches target as the 2 German ships turn north-northeast. Whitworth turns north to follow, putting Renown against the heavy seas. The rate of fire of the battlecruiser's turrets was starting to slacken now. Firing the guns had ripped away the protective blast bags of the mounts, allowing water to flood in whenever a wave smashed over the bow, and more water made its way into the turrets via the gun barrels themselves as the breaches were opened for reloading, with added steam from the heat build-up of repeated shots. The increased pitching of the ship also made it harder to spot and correct shot, and as Renown's fire slowed and became less accurate, at 04:40, Whitworth was forced to reduce speed to 20 knots in order to maintain any chance of scoring more hits. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau's lead started to increase. Soon there was enough of an interval between the flashes of Renown's guns and their arrival around Scharnhorst that the German vessel was able to start making course corrections whenever they saw the battlecruiser fire a salvo, ruining any targeting solutions. At about 0500, Renown turned east to stop fighting against the sea and tried to rebuild some speed, but at the same time, Lutyens' squadron disappeared behind a sleet shower and changed direction. By the time Renown resighted them, they were over 25 kilometers away. This was now too far for effective fire, and, to put an extra nail in the coffin, a turret had been so battered by the sea it suffered a brief mechanical breakdown. At 0557, Renown lost sight of the enemy again. Whitworth ordered the forward turrets to face away from the seas to minimise any more damage and pushed Renown all the way up to 29 knots, but by 0615 it was clear that Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had gotten away. At least tactically, this was an indecisive engagement. Long-range gunnery, when both the firer and target are moving in 3 dimensions, is tough at the best of times. Off Lofoten in the early hours of April the 9th, the heavy seas, darkness and bad weather made it even more difficult. Renown fired a total of 230 15-inch shells and scored 1 hit. She also fired 1,065 4.5-inch shells from her starboard secondary battery and only hit with 2. Gneisenau fired a total of 54 rounds of 11-inch and hit with 2, but only 10 of the rounds she fired were armor-piercing. In any case, the combination of a temporary loss of fire control due to Renown's hit on her foretop, and the fact that she was leading the way as Lutyens sought to disengage, meant that she had fewer opportunities to fire. Scharnhorst fired off 182 main gun rounds, all armor-piercing, but scored no hits, As the German warships spent the majority of the engagement trying to escape, most of these shells were fired from Scharnhorst's aft turret, Turret Caesar, which used up so much ammunition, shells had to be transferred through the ship from the forward magazines. So out of a total of 466 main battery rounds fired by all 3 capital ships, only 3 hit, and 2 of those may have been high explosive shells that were unlikely to deal any significant damage. In terms of the damage actually done, Renown's 2 hits were quickly dealt with. Some lucky crewmen got to climb up the mast and re-rig a temporary wireless aerial, though in the greater context Renown could still communicate with the outside world by signalling messages to her accompanied destroyers for them to transmit. The second hit, which resulted in flooding to some storerooms, was essentially negligible. Renown did suffer 1 casualty, however. 1 officer was wounded in the leg by splinters from a near miss. He stayed at his post throughout the engagement, but later had to have 2 of his toes amputated. The damage to Gneisenau was much more serious. The hit to her foretop had effectively neutralized her radar and primary gunnery control. While she could still fight using secondary fire control equipment, this was all located lower down the ship with much reduced fields of view and more visual interference from waves and spray, meaning that Gneisenau would be at a great disadvantage when spotting targets and fall of shot if it got into another engagement. This damage wasn't repairable at sea, it could only be fixed in port. Scharnhorst, on the other hand, hadn't taken any hits, but it had suffered extensive damage from the sea. With her forward turrets rotated to fire over the shoulder as they steamed away from Renown, the ejection ports for spent shells on the backs of the turrets had allowed water to flood in from the heavy seas. This had resulted in the modern electric motors for turret Anton's traverse short-circuiting, and after attempts to rig a manually operated traverse failed, the turret was essentially inoperable. As if this wasn't bad enough, there was also flooding damage to turret Bruno and some of the secondary guns to add to the immense stresses placed on the battleship by the sea. At 0618, a steam valve tripped and one of Scharnhorst's turbines stopped. It took an hour to get going again, briefly leaving her with a maximum speed of 25 knots. Renown hadn't escaped damage from the sea either, and this was exacerbated by the incredible blast of her own guns firing, but she was more able to sustain it than the more modern, less proven German designs. In the end though, although all the ships were degraded to some extent, they were all still afloat and still able to fight, with minor repairs able to be carried out at sea. At best, the battle was a draw. The state of affairs afterwards was essentially the same as it was before. If we start thinking operationally, we have a lot more to consider. After the battle, Lutyens kept on course to the north. Hitting 70 degrees latitude, he had effectively escaped the Royal Navy. The 2 battleships turned west and spent the rest of the 9th of April repairing what damage they could. Whitworth knew that HMS Repulse, Renown's sister ship, was approaching West Fjorden with more destroyers and ordered his own destroyers to join her while he turned west, no doubt still concerned about preventing a German breakout, but he was ordered back to West Fjorden by the Admiralty. The German destroyers escorted north by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had, however, already gone up the fjord and occupied Narvik after a brief one-sided fight against the Norwegians. All in all, the 6 landing forces of Operation Weserübung had reached their objectives without significant interference from the Royal Navy. Inside Norwegian waters, they mostly prevailed through a combination of speed, audacity and deception, exploiting Norwegian surprise and uncertainty. The only significant setback came at Oslo, but here German airborne troops seized Fornebu airfield, bypassing the coastal defences and capturing the Norwegian capital from there. So in this respect, the actions of Lutyens off Lofoten bear up. Although the engagement with Renown was the result of chance, the fact was that Whitworth's force would have been waiting for the Germans at the mouth of the Westfjorden had they not been decoyed away by the Royal Navy's uncertainty over German intentions. The diversionary movements of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau certainly contributed to that uncertainty, and while the capital ships were trading salvos out at sea, German destroyers were landing troops at Narvik. Although the British were able to concentrate forces to attack the Kriegsmarine in the next few days, the damage had been done, and Norway was well on the way to being occupied. From the Royal Navy perspective, Whitworth would have been derelict in his duty had he not attacked Scharnhorst and Gneisenau when he encountered them. The Royal Navy of World War II was hyper-aggressive, partly due to lessons learned from the First World War, but also because it really had anything to gain by holding back. The Kriegsmarine had a clear vested interest in preserving its forces to fight another day, but the Royal Navy could afford to take risks in order to increase its chances of sinking enemy capital ships. For all the uncertainties, it's hard to argue that Renown wasn't outclassed by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, but Renown could afford to get into a slugging match. Not only was the Royal Navy's aggressive behaviour a psychological edge that they kept over the Kriegsmarine, but Whitworth could count on more Royal Navy vessels arriving to finish off his opponents if he could fix or delay them long enough, whether that was by getting into an extended engagement or causing enough damage to reduce their speed. In the end, we can argue that Whitworth was to some degree unlucky. The prevailing conditions meant that, down at the tactical level, it was much easier for Lutyens to disengage than it was for Whitworth to score the hits he needed to slow him down. So we can say that this battle was an operational win for the Germans. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were able to avoid being fixed or heavily damaged, which suited German operational objectives, while Renown was unable to create conditions for future attacks by the Royal Navy. Stepping up again to the strategic, Operation Weserübung came at a high cost to the Kriegsmarine. Although the operation achieved its goals, and Norway was rapidly occupied, small German naval forces were scattered up and down the Norwegian coast, vulnerable to British air and naval assets. Some, like the destroyers Lutyens escorted up to Narvik, were unable to escape before the net could close and were lost. Others were damaged or sunk as they ran a gauntlet of submarine and air attacks trying to get back to Germany. Overall, in terms of major surface vessels, the Kriegsmarine lost 3 cruisers and 10 destroyers out of the 32 it started the war with. Considerably more were damaged and needed time in dock to repair, while personnel losses amounted to 2,375 dead or missing and 1,604 wounded. That was a considerable blow to German naval strength, and although more ships would be built and commissioned through the war, the Kriegsmarine's surface force never recovered.
The deception and diversionary effort undertaken by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau certainly managed to keep these losses down compared to what they would have been had the British home fleet gotten stuck in. But losses are losses, and those ships weren't coming back.
Whether such losses were worth the occupation of Norway, given that Germany had no realistic hope of directly challenging the Royal Navy and later the US Navy, is another question entirely. So there we are with a look at the Battle of Stromvaer, an indecisive tactical engagement contributing to German operational success in what was, at least for the Kriegsmarine, something of a Pyrrhic strategic victory. Running through all of these levels of war are the unique conditions of maritime warfare. Sea and weather conditions have considerably more impact than they do on land. The sheer scale of the maritime environment and the difficulties in finding and tracking the enemy results in a higher level of uncertainty. And the expense and time it takes to build warships means that losses are not quickly or easily replaced. Although some of these elements have changed over the course of history and continue to change today, they all contribute to making war at sea a very different beast to war on land. Hope you all enjoyed this one and found it interesting. If you'd like to support the channel and watch these videos early, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships. Whether you do or not, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.